Conor Joseph Donnan is a doctoral candidate in the history department at the University of Pennsylvania. He received his Bachelor of Arts in History from Ulster University in Ireland. Afterward, Conor moved to the United States, where he obtained a master's degree in historical studies from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Conor's current research at the University of Pennsylvania focuses on labor and immigration in 19th and 20th century America. Conor has always had a strong commitment to public engagement and conflict resolution. Before attending Penn, Conor was a conflict resolution volunteer at Corrymeela in Northern Ireland and a community volunteer at Quaker Cottage. He worked tirelessly to promote pathways to peace in Northern Ireland and received a United Nations Peace Day Community Medal from the Mayor of Belfast in 2013. Conor has also worked on presidential campaigns of Barack Obama and Bernie Sanders. Conor brought his activism to his profession as a historian by working as a board member of the Irish Railroad Workers Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, developing a historical video game and appearing on podcasts for the United States National Parks Service Heritage Area and Life FM radio. Conor is also one of the newest members of the board of directors for Someone to Tell It To. Conor, we warmly welcome you to our podcast today. It's really good to have you join us.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Big fan of the podcast, as you guys know.
Thank you.
Hey, Conor. So today was supposed to be a pretty special day in your life. Could you talk a little bit about what was supposed to happen today for everyone who is listening, and what are your plans from here?
Well, today was supposed to be my wedding day. I'm supposed to get married in about 3 hours from now, back home in Ireland, in the General Post Office, which is one of the coolest buildings in the entire country. We had about 150 people flying from America or going from Belfast, my home, to Dublin. And then around mid-March, with the pandemic stuff breaking out, we got emails from wedding venues and everybody, and they were saying, hey, we have to cancel your wedding. And that was very difficult. My fiance was like, she's a doctor, and she was saying, well, let's see how things develop. Maybe we'll be able to get there by May. And then by the end of March, I was like, Leah, we have to cancel or postpone this wedding. It's not really canceled. I was like, we have to postpone this wedding because everyone else has to worry about flight refunds and hotels and all of that stuff. So we gotta get this done. So yeah, today I was supposed to marry my beautiful fiance, Leah, and I suppose now she has another year to reconsider.
So you can't imagine anything you'd rather be doing today than hanging out with us.
Yeah, no, this is perfect. It's exactly what I envisioned when I envisioned today.
It's not what you planned, but we're glad to be able to share part of this day with you. So, Conor, as you mentioned earlier, you grew up in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and we believe that you have a very riveting story about your life there, and especially during the period called the Troubles. We'd love for you to talk about what the Troubles were and then how they impacted your life.
Okay, yeah, so that's perfect. The Troubles is sort of this, it's a weird name for, I always tell people, the Troubles is a weird name for a war, because it doesn't sound like a war, right? The Troubles sounds to me like, oh, we were, we couldn't get down the stairs. I was having a bit of trouble there or something. But essentially, the Troubles was a 30-year conflict in Northern Ireland. Started in the late 60s, sort of ended in in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement, and it was between Irish nationalists who tended to be Catholic and British Unionists who tended to be Protestant, as well as actual British armed forces. So the conflict, like I said, it lasted 30 years, and it started essentially because in the 1920s, Ireland was partitioned off, and Northern Ireland was created in a way that it would be predominantly Protestant British people, but they still had a sizable ethnically Irish Catholic population. And so one of the founders of Northern Ireland, the state, he described it as a Protestant state for a Protestant people, which meant in many ways Irish Catholics had less access to housing, less access to jobs and education, and places that were predominantly Irish Catholic in population ended up with a majority British Unionist elected officials. And so after Martin Luther King's civil rights movement, a lot of Irish people, including John Hume and Bernadette Devlin and those guys, got heavily influenced by the rhetoric and the ideas of the civil rights movement. So they tried to obtain the same level of citizenship as the British Protestants, and which is interesting when you think about it, because the Troubles essentially in the end become about the IRA wanting to be part of a united Ireland. But the civil rights movement really started, for the most part, with Irish Catholics asking the Protestant administration and the British government, like, if you're going to call us British, we want to have all of the same rights as someone who is British, And so essentially, a series of different events happened during the civil rights movement. One of them was the British Army shot a group of protesters in Derry, which led to 14 people being killed. And they said that the protesters had guns and that the protesters were in the IRA. 2000s, the British government comes out and said, in the 2000s, the British government came out and said, actually, that wasn't true. And we essentially covered up the military murdering innocent civilians. And that's really when, at that point, the IRA had essentially been non-existent. And there was writing on walls in places like Derry that said stuff like, I ran away, which is what they were saying. IRA is I ran away. And in my own neighborhood in Clonard, we had a series of violent events that led to many people in my neighborhood saying we need to actually build a new refurnished, rebranded IRA, which is one word, a sort of traditional provisional IRA that we now call the IRA comes from. And so over the course of the next 30 years, from the late 60s into the 90s, you get this incredibly violent conflict between the British Armed Forces and Protestant Unionists who consider themselves British in their militia against Irish Catholic communities and the Irish Catholic paramilitary of the different factions of the IRA. And so that claims 3,500 lives, which is, and around 40-odd thousand injured. And that, like, again, that in a lot of ways, it doesn't sound like a huge number in somewhere like America, where, you have over 300 million, nearly 400 million people. But if you were to times the population out into an American size, it would be about 600,000 people. That's essentially a low estimate of what you guys had on your Civil War. And so it impacted everyday life. There was during the 60s, they built a wall, which they called the Peace Wall. and by they, it's the sort of British establishment and the Protestant government built this peace wall that was about 40 foot high. It was in my back garden when I was growing up. And it was to separate Protestants from Catholics. And if you go there today, you'll see that those walls still exist. And basically they could shut down the walls at any point in the day to stop the communities from being able to interact with each other. And I think one of the psychological impacts of a peace wall, this barrier keeping you from the other side, as we would call them, is that the other side becomes imaginary. You don't really know who the other side is, and so you're okay with, throwing stones or people throwing petrol bombs or those types of things over walls, because those people don't really exist in your mind. I mean, that they're there, but they're not people in that sense. So like when I was younger, I was sleeping I lived in a bungalow with my mom and my brother, and in the middle of the night we got told to get out of the house because someone had thrown a petrol bomb onto our roof, and like our roof was like sort of catching fire, and so the whole community came out to try and put that out. And the interesting thing for me about that is that the people who threw that probably didn't think that it was a single mother and her 2 young kids in there. Like it wasn't, to them, there was no person,
Did you ever get hurt?
Specifically, I have been, like, I was walking past. It's really interesting, again, in this point, is that the community that I lived in was one of the most impoverished communities in the country, and actually in parts of Europe, for most of Western Europe. So 1 in 2 people in the area lived in poverty. There weren't a lot of options for young people. And so one of the things that young people would do when they were bored is actually just go up to the gates where the wall ended to start riots. And it wasn't really an ideological thing or a political thing in a sense. It was more of just a, we're bored and this is something to do type of thing, which is weird to tell people, but that's sort of the case. So one day I was walking past, particularly in the July period, when there's this Orange Order March, which is like a sort of Protestant marching band who celebrates the victory of King William of Orange, that contentiously marches through Catholic neighborhoods. And so in July, the tension rises real high. And so one day I was walking past the riot, and I just saw like something flying out from the sky, and people saying like people started running. And so I sort of got pushed to the ground in the running, and was hit with what is then a nail bomb. So it's sort of like, is an explosive bomb that shoots nails out. But luckily I wasn't like majorly injured. I have scars from on my knees a little bit, but that was sort of it. So I had been injured, but I didn't like lose a limb or a life, which, in those days wasn't uncommon, so I got very lucky in that sense. But we had people who, were injured by plastic bullets that were shot at them from the British Army, or what my cousin was shot with a water cannon, which is like, it sounds like a really fun thing. Everything sounds lovely when it, like, plastic bullets, like, don't sound that bad. I just imagine Nerf guns when you think of something like that. And a water cannon,
Meanwhile, I'm sitting in my son's bedroom, and he's got a whole wall full of Nerf guns behind me.
And then, a water cannon sounds fun, but this is essentially a tank with a giant hose that just shoots into like protest movements and stuff. And so my cousin was hit with a water cannon once, and it basically like knocked him out. But people were injured fairly regularly. One time I was playing football with my friend, and he like looked up at the sky and he was like, "What is that?" And then it just like a rock literally just hit him in the face, like someone had thrown a rock over the wall, and while we were playing football, and it just hit him. So it wasn't uncommon for people to be injured, or a lot of people worried about going anywhere that wasn't in our community because we were worried about what would happen if you went anywhere else.
I think it's fascinating that your observation, and I think it's very, very true and correct, that because of the wall, that neither you on your side or the people on the other side could really envision who was on the other side. And so therefore you really weren't real.
Yeah,
And so it's very easy to literally throw bombs, uh, and figuratively throw bombs, bombs, and have attitudes and feelings about one another without having any clue who one another was. And it just says a lot about our when we are separate from one another, when we can't engage with one another, when we can't listen to one another, when we can't talk with one another, when we can't see one another, how we demonize one another. And I think that's in a very significant understanding of what that kind of separation can do to our relationships and to one another.
yeah, I think that you're very right. Like I said, I don't blame the people who threw stuff over in our house when we were younger, or even hit my friend or anything like that, because like I don't think that they could have envisioned people at the other side. And what was interesting for me much later was when I got into my teens and the peace movement started. I met this young fellow called William, which is a very, very ethnically unionist Protestant name back home. Like, usually like an Irish person like me called Conor, like that's a dead giveaway that you're an Irish person. Where like where like William is essentially the same thing. Where like something like my little brother being called Dan, for example. Like Dan is sort of anyone could be Dan because it's like biblically neutral, that type of stuff. Uh, but So I met this kid William, and William was really fascinating to me because when I met him, we hung out for a few months, and we're still close friends now. But then, like, I went to his house once, and he literally lived like on the other side of the wall. Like, he was one of the people who would have been on the street adjacent to my street. You know, uh,
Wow.
so like I was like, wow, like this is literally someone from the other side of the wall. Uh, and my street had the wall in it because my street, in the '60s where I lived, well, I wasn't there in the '60s, but when where I like the location in which I lived in the '60s uh, was a neutral ground street. So Protestants would live on that street and Catholics would live on that street, and it was sort of like a neutral zone. Uh, and they built a wall in there and cut Cooper Street off from what then became the other side was Cooper Way, and the two like that the wall just went through that sort of neutral ground street. And it changes, I think, like you said, there's not much dialogue between people who live on other sides of walls, but even other stuff like the closest ice cream shop to me was at the other side of the wall, but I never would have went to an ice cream shop at the other side of the wall because that was dangerous. So like stuff like that like still impacts people. My generation less so, but like my mom's generation, like they see the wall as a safety net and they don't want the wall to ever come down. A lot of people, but my generation are more willing to go across, willing to make friends on the other side. And that's because we grew up sort of at the end of the conflict and into the peace. So we were like the peace babies, where, my parents or my grandparents who were born in the 60s or the 30s or something, who knew a full 30 years of conflict. They had like a different vision of how the peace would be achieved and this type of stuff. And it was really interesting for me too, because I was on a very weird side of the conflict, in that, as I said before, I lived in one of the most nationalist, pro IRA communities in the country. It was like us in South Armagh. And at the same time, my grandmother was a Protestant convert to Catholicism. So her uncles and her cousins were all like very devout British Protestants who some of them were in Protestant paramilitaries, and like wouldn't talk to my grandma because she married into an Irish Catholic family. And so it was really, my family had the conflict themselves too, which was fascinating.
Conor, we obviously have this joint love for the country of Ireland, and we've spent time there. We've mentioned that in previous podcast episodes, and even just last week we were talking with somebody else, trying to put into words what the country is like, just when we were there driving the countryside. And I think the word that we kept coming back to is just peaceful and serene. And yet Ireland has this long history of such immense persecution. And we'd like, for those who are listening who know nothing about Ireland's history, maybe you could just kind of talk about what Ireland's history has looked like, even prior to the Troubles.
Yeah, I mean, one of the fascinating things about Irish culture and Ireland in general, which I think you guys found when you were there, is that for a people with such a dark history, they tend to be some of the most welcoming and joking people that you will meet. Because, and I think I say to people all the time, like, when you grow up around stuff like the Troubles, you develop humor around other things that maybe don't seem as significant. But I mean, going back to Irish history, we're talking sort of what many will claim is 800 years of oppression from the British. I mean, British people first arrived in Ireland 800 years ago. Stronghold in which they eventually get doesn't really happen until the 1600s. But in the 1600s, you're talking, and in the 1500s, to be fair, you're talking about stuff like Oliver Cromwell, who just sorts out, basically, he goes from a civil war in England to conquering Ireland. And he basically, he goes in and he starts this conquest in 1649, ends in 1653. And it's estimated that he killed up to a quarter of the population. His army killed a quarter of the Irish population themselves, which is like way more per capita than like the famine, which I'll talk about later. But so he invaded Ireland and engaged in this brutal campaign against the Irish, who had supported many members of the sort of the British Crown against the English parliamentarians, which is what Cromwell ran. But they like hang people's heads on pikes to like let people know they siege Drogheda, and burn people who were hiding in churches. They burn the churches to the ground. And so Cromwell sort of pulls in the British, what is rapidly becoming the English and British colonial infrastructure into Ireland. And he conquers Ireland. Like I said, there are mass casualties throughout this sort of sieges in Drogheda, Limerick, and Galway. and starvation, because they literally cause famine there. And from there, what you get is laws put in place that ban the Irish language, ban Catholic schooling, uh, these sort of penal laws that are built in to stop um, the growth of the Catholic community. And then you get like the plantation of Ulster, which is quite famous, of sending like Scottish Presbyterians, especially into like Northern Ireland, what is today Northern Ireland, but was and still is the region of Ulster. And in Ulster, these planters come in and they take most of the land from the sort of Irish Catholic population. And Cromwell himself basically pushes the. Have you ever heard the expression "beyond the pale"?
Yes.
Yeah, and so
Yes.
that comes from Ireland, which is Dublin. Around that area is the Pale, and Cromwell basically wants all of the Catholic population out of the Pale, and so he tells them that they can either go to hell or to Connacht, and Connacht is like out west. So they kick all of the sort of indigenous Irish, or they try to push that Irish Catholic community out west in this massive colonial project. And so that's where the term "beyond the pale" comes from, because Dublin was the pale. Around Dublin, not just Dublin. And it's the epicenter of this growing English and eventually British empire. And so you get people routed, basically taken off their land and brought in, and their land given to landlords and conquests, basically conquerors who are not native to the country and often don't even spend any time in the country. And then taxes are imposed on the Catholic population that makes them pay tithes to the Church of England. So they're literally paying tithes to a church that is not their own. And so that builds up a lot of resentment in Ireland due to being displaced from your land, being forced to get rid of the language, which is essentially banned, having to pay for a church that's not your own. And so from the 1600s to the 1700s, these situations are getting worse. And then in the 1800s, Ireland is brought in. Basically, the Irish have a rebellion in 1798. It is quickly squashed by the British. And then in the 1800s, they pass the Act of Union, which brings Ireland into the Union and sort of takes away their own version of Parliament, which was heavily Protestant anyway, and places them under this sort of direct rule of the British in Westminster. And under those policies with the British in Westminster, we end up having a major famine in the 1840s that kills over 1 million people and has 2 million people flee the country, essentially. And then during this famine, the population of Ireland was 8 million, and it's never grown back to 8 million since then. And so it's this sort of darker history of famine and violence that keeps going on. And then eventually in 1916, you have a rebellion and the 1916 Easter Rising, in which a bunch of sort of Irish this sort of last gasp of the Fenian movement and the start of the Gaelic revival movement sort of combined to create a rebellion in 1916. And they more or less take control of Dublin for a couple of days while the British are fighting in a war, because the sort of old slogan of this time was "England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity." And so they're like, well, they're distracted by the Germans, so we'll hit them while they're distracted. We'll take the country back. And the plan doesn't go exactly well. And eventually the rebellion is put down in a very brutal fashion. The British send a gunboat up the River Liffey and basically blow the whole city to the ground. And and then all of the leaders, most people at the time weren't really in support of the rebellion, but all of the leaders are executed in like a very brutal fashion, and that changes the tide of the rebellion. So James Connolly, who was one of the leaders, is injured during the battle and is going to die anyway, and he can't stand for his execution. So they tie him to a seat and shoot him in a seat. And Joseph Plunkett, who is engaged to his fiancée Grace Gifford, has his last request be that he can marry his fiancée, and so he marries his fiancée, and then a few hours later is executed. And so that sort of changes the tide, and people are saying, okay, well, like it's okay to punish them, but like this is going overboard. And so the Irish, the rising leaders, end up successfully getting people to their cause, and that leads to the rise of Sinn Féin, who win 1918 election and declare independence. And then we have a war of independence between the British and the Irish. And once that is settled, we have a civil war right after the War of Independence between the pro-treaty Irish, who have accepted the end of the war on the condition that Ireland has Dominion status, which isn't a free independent republic, but they see as a stepping stone to that. And the anti-treaty section, who see sort of the treaty as giving up the country and dividing the country, because Northern Ireland is created out of accepting the end of the war too. And it goes to there. And so it's a violent history, and it's one of colonial oppression and imperialism that you see sort of around the world later. And what's interesting about this is that if you look at, in my own research on Irish people and indigenous populations in America, like Native American nations, you find that a lot of the people who are originally colonizing America are the same people who were colonizing Ireland. Like you can literally see the same guys appear on like land documents. So people call Ireland a testing ground for the British Empire. And so you have this bloody history, violent history that impacts Ireland, I think, every day psychologically, but also it makes them now. Some of the unfortunate situations of that are that some of the Irish writers and plays and stuff that we have like are known for that darkness, like Bram Stoker in Dracula, or Oscar Wilde in The Picture of Dorian Gray, or many of these Irish writers are known for dark writing. And so my fiance will say, Connor, why are we watching this Irish movie? All Irish movies are depressing. And I was like, well, because 800 years of oppression does something to you.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, yeah, as you know, we're both huge fans of history, and I recently read The Immortal Irishman by Timothy Egan.
Oh, yeah.
Per your recommendation, and it was just so helpful for me to learn more about Ireland's history after having visited there and just knowing almost nothing, sadly, about the country at that point in time. And yeah, just learning more about this oppression that your people have lived with for such a long time, and learning some of the statistics, as you mentioned earlier. Just I didn't know that 1 million people had died during the Great Famine of the mid 1800s.
Yeah.
It's just horrifying, and it's just impossible to even imagine if you were to go visit now and see this beautiful serene countryside, to just envision what was not too far in the distant past. And we've often said in some of the the sermons we've given, we've talked about, history and the importance of just learning from it, that otherwise we're doomed to repeat it, right? As the famous quote says. So I think it's just helpful for those who are listening and for us to know a little bit more about Ireland's history as we talk about, some of your work going forward.
Yeah, and I think you're totally right about understanding history and what understanding history means. Like recently, not too long ago, when the Brexit debate was happening, which is seems like a million years ago considering this pandemic now, there was a discussion about with among the British about like how do we get the Irish to agree to this border dispute, because one of the reasons we have a peace agreement is that being in the European Union essentially means that there's no border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and so those two states don't have to have a separation, which allows the island to be one island for the most part. I mean, there's still currency changes and stuff like that, but for the most part, it's a seamless transition into one Ireland. And Brexit, with the UK leaving the European Union and forcing Northern Ireland to leave the European Union, because again, Northern Ireland actually voted to stay in the European Union, but are being forced out by the English and Welsh vote, essentially, because Scotland also wanted to stay in the European Union. They would essentially they would have to make a hard border, which is against the spirit of the peace agreement that I grew up with. It's literally infringing on this peace agreement in many ways. And the interesting thing was a conservative commentator, she said to them, or she said on the news, well, we'll tell, like, if the Irish don't do what we say, we can threaten them with food shortages, essentially.
Mm.
It's like,
Wow.
this is 2016. We have like literally so much literature on the famine, like a famine that like was caused by a potato blight, but facilitated by the British administration's inability to care about Irish people. And even the head of the Treasury at the time, Charles Trevelyan, says that the sad thing about this famine is it'll kill 1 million people, but that's not enough people. So there are people like, so this lady is saying we'll threaten them with food shortages to a country that has literally had a famine based on the colonial power that like has been like that the British had used in the 1840s, and I was like, how can you not learn that this is not the right thing to say?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I remember that when we were in Ireland and then we're headed into Northern Ireland, it was literally the middle of the night. You remember that, Tom?
Oh,
and
yeah.
And there were
Well, yeah, I
about,
remember it because I was awake. You were asleep in the
no,
back.
no. I actually was awake, and I realized, but I actually did wake up, and Connor, you talk about the open borders, and there was the border was totally open. There was no anything to indicate that we had just entered Northern Ireland, except that on our phones. That's
Yeah,
that's how we knew. Got a text
Mm-hmm.
message on my phone saying, you've just entered, Northern Ireland. The British.
Yeah.
It was mentioned about Britain and everything, and so that's how we knew that we had gone into the country. So you anticipated a question we were going to ask about post-Brexit and what it does mean for the country and for these open borders and for the very free-flowing exchange between Ireland and Northern Ireland, as well as other European countries. So how do you think this will impact Northern Ireland, your home country? Will particularly, do you think it will impact it for the worse?
Well, yeah, I think that that's a good question, and one I've tried to grapple with a lot, as I often write for a think tank in Philadelphia about Irish policy. And one of the things I've questioned a lot is sort of what's going to happen with Brexit. And I think the short answer of like what happened is that the the English just didn't think it through. They don't know anything about Ireland really. They're not like well educated on the subject, and they were just more interested in sort of getting rid of immigrants and having some sort of return to the imperial power that they were, because the sort of make Britain great again rhetoric of Boris Johnson and those guys, you have to ask then, okay, but when was Britain great? And what they mean is like pre World War II, when we had an empire, really pre World War One, but like pre World War II, when we had an empire and we were able to trade with everybody and we were the kings of the sea. And so I think that they were more thinking of this sort of English nationalism situation and not really about Ireland. And one of the things that is fascinating is that the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland, that peace agreement that ended the troubles, that allowed me to work in peace of work for the predominantly, or the first 5 or 6 years of my teenage years into my early 20s, was that it was underpinned by the fact that Ireland and Britain were both in Europe. So that allowed essentially no border. Like you said, there are little things that would tell you crossed, but you wouldn't even notice them. So changing from miles per hour, which the British use, to the European standard, or changing, or the big thing is that your phone, say you have O2 is a common phone in the UK and Ireland company. So if you had O2 in the UK, when you cross the border, it'll say you are now entering O2 Ireland, right? And so that's how you know that you've crossed the border. So it's little things like that, but for the most part, you can come and go, do what you want, do as you please. And if your argument on the English side is that you don't want immigrants and you want to have more control over trade and you want to leave this Eurozone, you have to have a hard border. There's no way around it. Like Boris Johnson was coming up with all these magical solutions of having satellites in the air that would shoot down and see what's in cars and blah, 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 blah. We don't have technology like that. That's just not possible. And even if you did, there's no way to stop a border. They have to have a border, which like completely undermines the Good Friday Agreement. And the other thing is, and this is from a perspective of someone who has been an Irish Catholic in Belfast, is that one of the things that we had in place in the Good Friday Agreement was that the British had to adhere to the human rights conventions of the European Union. And so that doesn't seem like a big deal, but for people from my community who had been arrested indefinitely without trial and without evidence on a policy called internment, or had Margaret Thatcher tell her soldiers that she had a policy of shoot to kill. So if you suspect this person is in the IRA, don't try and take him in, just shoot him and kill him. Like the European Human Rights Convention is what we believe keeps us safe. Like no one trusts the British government to keep the Human Rights Convention safe when there's no European Union, because the track record is not good, so it's an interesting break in that sense too, unfortunately. And you would like to hope the best and hope that the British would maintain a lot of the human rights issues and those types of things, but a lot of older people, especially who grew up in a time where they were falsely imprisoned or imprisoned without trial, would be distrustful, I think. And I think there's a fair reason to be distrustful, unfortunately. And so you've got that, and then you've got this border that would, potentially make Ireland a very separate, like make Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland two very separate states. Like there's no real way around that. That would be difficult, especially for people who live on the border, like people who live in Armagh, Monaghan, like those sort of border states, like then having to deal with not being able to drive 5 miles up the road anymore That type of stuff will bring a lot of tension. I don't know necessarily if it'll bring a lot of violence, but people have predicted that. And there has been a little bit of a rise in pro-Irish nationalist paramilitary activity, but not what you find is that the actual population of Northern Ireland does not support a return to war. No one really wants that. But, you know, one of the things that I can tell you from history and that I can tell you from personal experiences is the tide can change in an instant. You know, like it only takes one or two bad events to change public opinion completely. And the other thing that's fascinating is that Ireland is getting wealthier, especially the Republic is getting wealthier due to being sort of the poster child of the European Union now. While Northern Ireland is not gaining as much wealth and is not expected to benefit from Brexit, so it'll actually lose money in that sense. And that's been really fascinating. But it has definitely increased tensions, I think. The pandemic has sort of decreased some of the tension a little bit, I think, in that a lot of the unionists who consider themselves British tried to follow Boris Johnson's COVID policies and then realized that he wasn't really effectively dealing with the COVID-19 issue. And then in the Republic, the Prime Minister Leo, he is a doctor and has dealt relatively effectively with those policies. And so they quickly realized that they had to follow the Ireland suit and not the British suit. And the other thing is just that, you know, a pandemic doesn't respect made up borders. So you have to have an all Ireland, agenda for stuff like that. And it also undermined those institutions because it's very hard to have an all Ireland agricultural policy and an all Ireland tourist policy, and like which we do have institutions that do all Ireland institutions that work north and south. But you can't really have an all Ireland agricultural policy if one person is adhering to the European standards and the other person is not, you know, and so it'll be weird. But I think COVID in a way shows you that we do need to be dealing with things in an all island fashion. And hopefully that'll help out a little bit in easing tensions.
Conor, I think you've heard, at least you've heard me talk previously about my love for the band U2. And several years ago, I had the chance of hearing U2 live in concert, and it was shortly after 9/11. I'm from northern New Jersey, and I would go into New York City and hear live shows, and I got to hear U2 right after 9/11, just a couple months later at Madison Square Garden, and it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life for sure, where they literally had a lot of service workers up on stage playing their instruments with them, for those who had lost friends and family members, and just this powerful experience. And two things really stood out to me that night. One is they sang the song Bloody Sunday, which I'd love to ask you about, because you had referenced this horrible incident that had occurred. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. And the second thing is, one of my absolute favorite U2 songs is the song is called Psalm 40. And it comes from the Psalm 40. U2, for those of you who are listening, they needed one more song on one of their albums. And Bono just happened to open up the Bible, and he turned to Psalm 40 and then put this priceless psalm to music. And in the psalm and in the song, he uses this refrain, "How long must we sing this song?" And he repeats it over and over and over again. And here at Madison Square Garden that night, he was singing it. Everybody's just weeping because, you know, how long must we sing this song of terrorism and oppression and, you know, just these horrible things that humans can do to one another. And it was just this uplifting experience. And I'd love for you to talk just about, what does peace and reconciliation look like, and how long must we sing this song? So I'd love for you to talk about those two things if you could.
Yeah. So I did reference Bloody Sunday earlier a little bit when I was talking about the mass shooting and the protest, and basically what is now called Bloody Sunday, or some people refer to it as the Bogside Massacre, which the Bogside is part of Derry, which is where it occurred, happened in 72, and basically British soldiers shot 26 unarmed civilians in a protest, and 14 people died from that. 13 right away, one from injuries later. And obviously, Bono, being from Ireland, not necessarily from the north and not necessarily involved in the conflict, but it hear the news, famously wrote Bloody Sunday, which is, I think, one of their best songs by a mile.
In
But the
fact, actually, I think I read a Rolling Stone article that it was the 272nd all-time greatest songs on the 500 song list. So
Oh,
just some
cool.
brief reference. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And he has, Bono has a very activist nature in him, as you guys know, obviously. And so yeah, and so basically what happened anyway was that this massacre happened, and the civilians were blamed for being, violent, having guns, all this stuff. And this inquiry came out called the Savile inquiry, which the Widgery inquiry came out first, and the Widgery inquiry basically said, this was, a bunch of potential terrorists protesting, and we have to, they were bordering on violence anyway, and we had to act. So that was sort of what happened originally, and then there was a 12-year investigation by what was called the Savile Inquiry after Widgery, and the Savile Inquiry comes out in 2010. So 72 to 2010, and in 72, they're saying these guys were violent protesters with guns and this type of jazz. And then in 2010, the Savile Inquiry comes out and says that the killings were completely unjustified and unjustifiable, and that the soldiers knowingly put false accounts into the reports. And so the prime minister of of Britain at this time, David Cameron, in 2010, has to apologize for a massacre that happened in 1972, which had caused a lot of resentment because people knew, one of my friends, a member of his family, was one of the victims of this shooting, who I met in university years later, and his family were always very, upset about what was the unjustified killing of one of their family members, obviously, but also just the cover up of this killing. And so
That's a
Bloody
lot of years
Sunday,
in between time when
yeah,
it
yeah,
occurred to an apology.
yeah. I mean, it's what, like 40,
40
almost
something
40
years.
years.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it was a big deal for Irish Catholics at that time, because this was an example of British brutality and their willingness to cover this up, and it sort of stuck in the cultural imagination, which is why Bono has this really great song. Um, and that's like a hard thing to deal with, because when the peace movement came in 1998, really kicking off in the 2000s, and I start my work with Corrymeela and the Quakers, basically cross community work in the Quakers, which was bringing young Protestant people and young Catholic people together in a safe, neutral environment where they could all hang out. And the Quakers were respected for the work they did with people who had, who had family issues, people who were impoverished, all of these things, that they were allowed to go to both sides. There were certain organizations that were respected enough that they could go in and out. And Corrymeela and the Quakers were both those. And so when I was working at Corrymeela and at the Quakers, we would one of the things we'd be trying to do is take people out of the mindset that you're talking about, like the song that they sing, you know, how long, you know, we're talking, taking people out of this song that they've been singing, the story that they've been told their entire life, and trying to have them sit down and look at each other as just people, you know, and say, look, like this is a person, he identifies in this way, but he is also just a person. Or this is a person and she identifies in this way and she is also just a person. And you know, what you found is we called it the seed program, because the idea is you would take young people, you would help them get to know people who weren't from their community, who were from the other side, so called, and have them be the seed that was planted in their community to actually say, like, hey, like, I have friends who are this and that, and they are Catholic, they're Protestant, and they're great people, or this is one of my favorite things to do is to go on this project once a month for a weekend to hang out with these guys, and hope that that seed grows and influences people. So yeah, I think that it's definitely been like peace and reconciliation is is a difficult and worthwhile project for anyone who wants to be involved in an organization like Carmilla or that. But one of the things that I really understood from my experience there and gained from my experience there is that a lot of the issues that were coming up in Ireland, and one of the reasons I became so interested in someone to tell it to at the same time when I came to America, was that a lot of the issues that I grew up with was just an inability to empathize with another, like, groups from the other side, and an inability to listen to, like, what may have been legitimate grievances, what may have been illegitimate grievances, depending on what the circumstances, but just being able to listen and treat people as human and as normal, you know. And so, like I said, from that piecework at Carmilla, I met my friend who lived at the other, literally the other side of the wall, and he and I became very close friends from that. And that was like fascinating to me because we had grown up like less than 100 feet apart from each other, you know, but we'd never been able to know who the other person was. And he'd been told all of his stories, and I'd been told all of my stories. And we, you know, so like little things just change. So like the Irish flag is green, white, and orange, as you guys know. It's the tricolor flag. And but Protestants were told the green is supposed to be Catholic, and the white is supposed to represent some sort of unity or peace, and then the orange representing Protestantism. But my friends who were Protestant were told that it was green, white, and gold, and that changes the meaning, because gold is not, you know, the color that they identify with, as like they're culturally, a lot of the Protestants are in like the orange order, or they, you know, talk about King William of Orange. So, you know, just the little stories, little changes like really matter. And if you're not able to think in a way that is empathetically or compassionately, because you have been told these stories, it's really difficult to, you know, to break that down. And that's why, you know, groups like Someone to Tell It To, teaching people about listening and compassion, are so important in that sense, you know. And even outside of conflicts, like with other things like increased polarization in America, I tell people all the time, like, hey, I've been down the road where we don't talk to people about what's going on, and I've seen what that's like. It's not fun. You know, I'm like, I promise
Yeah.
you, the best thing that you can do is have dialogue, talk to people, listen to people, be compassionate, even if you think that they are, you know, angry conservatives or crazy leftists or whatever you want to call them. You know, treating those people who you disagree with is as human. And we even see this in like, if we go like biblically here, you know, Jesus literally says, oh, it's easy to love the people that you love. That's nothing. You know, like, you know, what we need you to do is love the people that you don't love. And I think that that's, you know, from conflict resolution, one of the things that I think is that we have to try, even if it's extra hard, you know, to love the people who don't agree with us. And in doing so, that's what creates the better world, is listening to people and being compassionate about it and loving people as if they are just people at the end of the day.
It's a lot harder to love people that we don't know either.
Yeah.
Exactly. Who are and have been some of the heroes to you in your life? The people whether you've known them personally, or people you know about from afar. You know, the teachers, the politicians, artists, musicians, activists. Um, who poets? Who are those who have influenced you the most, and why?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard because I think, most people, we're sort of a collection of the stories that we, we're told, and we are built with sort of the people that we meet. I read a study once that said you are the combination of the five people that you talk to the most, which was fascinating. And so for me, I mean, number one, then this is sort of the answer that most people give, but is 100% true, is my number one hero is my mom. She is a single mother, grew up in poverty, had two kids when she was like first kid, me at like 19, and my little brother 4 years later. She raised two kids on her own while dealing with diagnosed extreme depression, and she pushed us to take the opportunities that she wasn't given during the peace movement. And she also was one of the rare people uh, in 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 the world, I think, who really just doesn't care about your background. As long as she thinks that you're nice or fun, she can hang out with anybody. And that really taught me to be more open to other people, and pushing me to go to school, pushing me to do all these other things. My mom was the number one. And then, weirdly, two separate people, uh, in terms of people who I've known, and then I'll go into like sort of the bigger, more abstract people. But people that I knew was Father Alec Reed, who was a priest in my monastery. I was I was an altar boy there for a little bit, but that's where I attended church growing up. And Father Alec was like a Tipperary man from down south who came to the north in like the early 60s, and just as he comes there, the troubles break out. And Father Alec was the go-between between the SDLP, which is the nonviolent nationalists, who were sort of more parliamentarian, and then the Sinn Féin, who were also a political party but had stronger connections to the IRA, and he was the go-between to help negotiate a ceasefire. And he was also the go-between for the British. So the British, the moderate nationalists, and the Irish Republicans all trusted Father Alec. He stopped, along with Father Des Wilson, the first hunger strike before the major hunger strike in the 80s, in which Bobby Sands and all those guys unfortunately passed away due to fighting for political prisoner status under Thatcher. He was able to help stop the first one, and he helped negotiate peace in Ireland. And there's this really famous picture of him. I think if you guys ever look it up, uh, it's called the. I mean, people. I don't know what it would be called. People just call it the corporal killings, which two British corporals essentially were killed after. Essentially, what happened is there was this major IRA funeral for some volunteers in the IRA who were killed by the British Army, and then a unionist guy tried to go in and interrupt the funeral. He was shooting and throwing grenades because he figured he could get the IRA members who were at the funeral. And obviously that really enraged a lot of the Irish Catholic community, because funerals are, it should be sacred, it should be a time to mourn, and they're fleeing for their lives there. And so one of the issues comes up a lot later as these two British corporals sort of accidentally get caught in the mix, and they get brought out and they're executed. And Father Alec Reed tries to resuscitate them and revive them. And there's this picture of him sitting over the body of the soldier trying to bring them back to life. And later, what was interesting about that is what he said is that, like, that day he had just picked up, like, basically the first draft of the peace agreement to bring to from Jerry Adams to John Hume. So he literally is trying to revive these people who were killed in a violent conflict while holding the document for peace in his back pocket the entire time. And so Alec was one, and then at Carmilla, another guy who was a real big inspiration for me was actually a Protestant minister called Ray Davey. And Ray was a World War II chaplain who was captured by the Germans and imprisoned in Dresden. And while in prison in Dresden, the British bombed Dresden and, like, basically leveled the place. And so he watched the Germans and the British, like basically engage in, like, incredible acts of cruelty and violence. And he decided that he was going to try to single-handedly stop war. And so he created Carmilla as a peace and reconciliation center, which then during the Troubles becomes, like, a major key to building peace. But he, like, was a powerhouse who, like, was, you know, respected by everybody, friends with the Dalai Lama, you know, like he was just, like, this major peace advocate and, like, this incredible powerhouse. And so him and Alec, both of them, Father Alec and Ray Davey, were both, like, these powerhouse ministers, preachers, you know, which is very fascinating to me because today, especially growing up as a Catholic, people are always saying to me, like, oh, like, the church or whatever. And it's odd because for me, all of the religious figures in my life, including yourselves, have all been, you know, positive, highly motivated, great people who are trying to change the world. And so I'll say, well, remember, like, just because there are people who do bad things because of religion does not mean that people who are religious are bad, right? Like, I've seen some of the most beautiful acts of humanity and humility, you know, come from Ray Davey or Alec Reed or yourselves that, like, you know, don't normally get credited for doing such a thing. And so sort of in the immediate, and then one of my other ones would have been my high school teacher who I still talk to every day, Mr. Watson, Lawrence Watson, because he was essentially the person who pushed me to go to university and now in this PhD program and all of that jazz. And so those would be the personal ones.
All that jazz.
All that jazz. Yeah. I think it's more than jazz.
It's more than jazz.
And so, yeah, and then sort of in the more abstract sense, I always really loved learning about the civil rights movement. I love Martin Luther King, but I really, really was fascinated by both him and Malcolm X and sort of Malcolm X's end of life transformation. And so they were really cool sort of heroes of mine when I was younger. There's a lot of murals to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King in Belfast and in Northern Ireland in general. So they were very cool people. And there's, like, in terms of sort of the more famous examples, I think, like, you know, those guys, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. Recently, because of you guys, I've been really turned on to watching Mr. Rogers, which I'd never really seen that much of as a kid. And so I really enjoyed learning about him, and I thought he was a fantastic person. I watched his documentary and it was incredibly shocking to me because I was like, okay, but when is something bad going to happen here? You know, no one is this great. When is something bad going to happen? And then it turns out that he was just incredibly fantastic. And yeah, I think that I'm trying to imagine more of the major figures that I really like.
As
Um,
you're thinking about that today, very appropriately, is Fred Rogers Day in the state of Pennsylvania. Um, it's been designated by our governor last year, and so every year now on this date, he is remembered and commemorated because he's a native son and
mm,
one of the state's most well, sorry, most wonderful, glorious citizens.
yeah,
For
yeah.
those of you who are
That
listening and you're curious about 143 Day, actually, I just found out though. I think Michael, I think it was yesterday
Oh, was it
because
yesterday?
yeah, which I
Okay, then
am sad that we missed it. It
yeah,
would have been nice to publicize
I
about it,
knew it
but
was
it's the
okay.
143rd day of
Third,
every year, so it would have been it would have been
yes, that would
yesterday.
have been
Anyways,
yesterday. Sorry.
for those who are
yeah,
listening, and this was discussed in the Fred Rogers documentary, is that he weighed 143 pounds for most of his adult life, and he stayed the same weight, which is pretty remarkable. And the significance of 143 is the letter I love you, based on the letters of the alphabet and where they fall in line. And so, he took that very, very seriously. And so, yeah, as Michael mentioned, the governor had announced last year that every 143rd day of every year is going to be
that's amazing.
Fred Rogers Day.
And we'll
Yeah,
remember it next week. We need to learn to count better. But
that's right.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I,
I was so sad when I saw that on Twitter this morning that it was yesterday. I was like, how did we not
Well,
not
I saw it this
not know that?
morning and thought, oh, they mean today, as opposed that
Yeah.
they were talking about yesterday. So
yeah, yeah. That's fascinating. I mean, that's such a cool. I mean, the discipline you have to do that. I could not weigh the same weight forever. But but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, my other figures that I really enjoy like learning about. I read a really great biography on Ella Baker, and if you haven't read on Ella
no.
Baker, the civil rights activist, she was like I think also because of my mom in itself. One of the things that I really look up to are women who changed the world, and so Ella Baker being one of those women. She was an American civil rights activist, and what she was really interesting for is that she didn't want a centralized infrastructure. Like she wanted a lot of like she wanted young people to take control, and she wanted uh, young activists to have their voice heard, and not to like look to her as just a leader, but to look to you know to each other and to the community as a whole, which in the civil rights movement is like very unique, because when you look at the civil rights movement, you think of Martin Luther King, or of Rosa Parks, or major figures, but she was really this like incredibly strong, incredibly radical, like much more radical in her vision of democracy than most people, and very grassroots activist. So I think that like Ella Baker was a very cool. Like if you haven't read her biography, I'll have to send you guys the biography, because it was one of my favorite history books that I've read in a while. I don't really. It's weird because I'm a historian, but I don't. And probably because I'm a historian, I don't really actually enjoy that many history books. I have to like really be like, oh, this is like a good history book, And so Barbara Ramsey wrote a book called Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, and her book was amazing. And so Ella Baker would be one, and then yeah, in Irish history, and Bernadette Devlin, who I'd mentioned in the protest, she was there during the civil rights movement in Ireland. She made friends with Angela Davis in America. Um, they were really cool. Like she was the youngest elected MP in history at one point. I think that's been broken now, but she was just like a fury activist. Like no one wanted to mess with no one wants to mess with Bernadette Devlin because she was just a badass. And you know, and I think that, you know, one of the things that they did is they fought for what they believed is right. But the other thing that I think that they did was that they went and listened to other people who were having issues and tried to, and that's what I really respect about them. Like, you know, Angela Davis and Bernadette Devlin becoming friends is an incredible story, just because this is, you know, someone who's really famous for sort of Irish nationalist movement, someone who's really famous for uh, like Black Power movements, and they end up developing this really strong friendship. And the only way that you can really see that is their willingness to see humanity and be compassionate to other people, you know. So I really respect those guys too, or those sort of strong women, especially in an age where, you know, it was like the 70s and the 60s, you know, coming up when people were not friendly. I mean, still even today we see this, but not as friendly to women in politics even as we are today. And, you know, today we aren't always great about it either, as we've learned.
Yeah, there's so many things that we could respond to there. I mean, I know for me, I read Malcolm X's autobiography when I was in college, and that, oh my goodness, that book really shaped my worldview significantly. Um, as you know, one of the things that Michael and I do, we've always made a commitment to be reading together since we first started, really since we first knew each other, you know, a decade ago or more. And one of the books that we've been rereading for the second time this year that we've made a commitment to is called the Book of Joy. And I think we've told you a little bit about it, but it's this week where a writer brought together the Dalai Lama and Bishop Desmond Tutu for an entire week just to talk about the topic of joy for one of their 80th birthday celebrations. And in the book, Richard Moore was talked about, and we're not sure if you've ever heard the name Richard Moore, but anyways, Richard Moore was shot with a rubber bullet between the eyes and became blind at ages 9 or 10. And he grew up and married and had two daughters. And he found the British soldier who had shot him and offered his forgiveness, and they became good friends. Both went to Dharamsala to teach Tibetans about forgiveness, and he was a hero of the Dalai Lama. And this occurred during the Troubles. And
Oh yeah,
yeah,
he got
the
shot in
question I
primary
have
school.
for you, what's that?
It was coming out of like elementary school essentially, right?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so just this remarkable story. But I think we'd like to hear from you just to talk about the topic of forgiveness and how forgiveness plays such a significant role in reconciliation and peace.
hmm I think, yeah. I like the easy questions. Like I see.
That's it. That's it. We're gonna throw you a curveball there, and
Yeah.
that one's gonna be
Well,
tough to hit.
yeah, I think that on any side of reconciliation, and I tell, you know, people when we're doing reconciliation all the time, is that uh, everyone involved in the conversation has to be willing to forgive. That doesn't mean that you have to say that the person was justified or the actions were fair or any of those types of things. But like with my own community back home, and I would constantly say to people like, okay, but what do we do if we don't forgive people, right? Like what is the next step? Do we just live in walled communities forever? You know, that's not a good step for me, and that's not like how I want people to live. And that's not how I think most people want to live. And so for me, forgiveness is central, and it's also, you know, sort of, how would I best explain this? It's like forgiveness is not something that you can sort of commoditize or measure, right? Like you may be in a situation where you have to forgive someone for stuff that they have done to you that you consider much worse than what you have done to them. But it's not sort of a it's not about like equally forgiving each other. I sort of talk about it as sort of a well that never ends. I'm like, look, like you just have this forgiveness well, and you have to just let it keep going, and know that it's not going to drain, and make sure that you put that as central. You can't really Society can't move forward and in a way that is productive, and we can't help make a better world if we're not willing to forgive. And that's unfortunate that we have to forgive in the first place, because ideally we would live in a society where nothing bad happened and no one would have to forgive anyone for anything. But unfortunately that's not the case, and so it might seem unjust, or it might seem like unfair, but what you have to remember is we live in a community, and we want our community to be based on love and mutual respect, and all of the sort of good qualities of humanity. And one of the good qualities of humanity is forgiveness and moving forward. And so yeah, I think it's essential. And I'd say to people all the time, like, and I've seen acts of forgiveness that are like mind boggling, right? Like I've seen IRA members meet with the people who had put them in jail, like British soldiers and stuff, in part of Carmila and other organizations that facilitated those talks and reconciliation talks. And these are people who had like, we would go and sit in a bar together. And I'm thinking to myself, like, 10 years ago you were trying to kill each other, and here we are now hanging out and making jokes about how you were trying to kill each other. And so I'm like, if these guys can move on, forgive each other, and live a normal life, even though they know what they were involved in and what the other side was more or less involved in, uh that that's such a compassionate act and such an incredible act, that like, how can you not move forward when you see people doing stuff like that? Like, how can you not build upon like such great acts of humility and forgiveness? And I think that every day, like, it doesn't have to be that, like, we don't always need a story. I think I've told you guys I'm an avid journaler. I love to write in my journal every day. And people, when I tell them, I'll say like, oh yeah, like when I write in my journal, and they say, I would just have nothing to write. I don't have anything interesting to write. And I'm like, well, it doesn't have to be like groundbreakingly philosophical. You know, uh, the everyday feelings and thoughts that you have are as important as anything else. And so, everyday acts of forgiveness, which are hard too. I mean, often
Mm.
the most difficult acts of forgiveness are the ones with the people we're closest with, even if it's something silly like oh, how could you leave the porch light on? Uh, Sometimes we find those harder to do than forgiving people who have had major impacts in our lives in other ways. And so some people find it easier to forgive their high school bully than they do to forgive their significant other. And I think that just the everyday forgiveness is important, and those little acts of compassion, those little acts of charity and forgiveness and kindness are really what makes the world better. Like, people always think, well, we need this magical change to happen to revolutionize the world and make it better. I'm like, well, the world will get better if we all act with compassion and forgive the shortcomings of everybody else and treat people in the same way. And like, that's what I would tell people when we did peace and reconciliation, is like, look, like, these guys, like, their community have harmed your community has harmed their community. Like, they're like, that's what happened. But if you don't forgive each other and try to move forward and build a base where you see these people as human, you're just keeping this cycle going. And what's the point in the cycle? Like.
As you're describing that, I'm reminded of in the gospel account when Peter comes to Jesus and he asks, Lord, how many times do I need to forgive? And Jesus says to him, not just 7 times, but 77 times. And basically it's like an insurmountable amount of times. Like it's going to
Yeah.
be a constant process for the rest of your life of forgiveness. So it's
Yeah.
working towards a goal that in some ways is never going to be probably achieved in our lifetime, but as you mentioned, it's those simple everyday acts of forgiveness that do, we want to believe, move mountains.
Yeah, I think like for every fantastic story of forgiveness, which should inspire us and should be important, I think like for every sort of Richard Moore out there with his incredible story, we also have to remember and appreciate the time we forgave the person who cut us off to get a parking spot at the Walmart.
Right. All of it matters. All of it makes a difference. Yeah, absolutely right. Once your PhD work is done, Connor, what do you hope to do once you're out of school, or have you have you not even considered that, or don't you want to consider that
I want to consider it. uh,
yet?
it's coming slowly but surely, but it's coming. The PhD will be finished, I hope, by December. Um, I mean, it's hard because there's a lot of things that like I'm passionate about and work in different ways. And so I think I would love to be in academia because I like talking to young people, helping them discover their sort of intellectual trajectory and talk and challenging them on presumptions that they have about history. One of my favorite classes to teach is sort of the modern American history class that I teach today, or not right now, but that I've normally taught. And it's been fascinating for me to show people. Recently, or a TV show came out called Mrs. America, and I don't know if you guys have seen that yet. But it's a show about the Equal Rights Amendment and both the Gloria Steinem sort of pro Equal Rights Amendment people, and also like the Phyllis Schlafly anti Equal Rights Amendment Stop ERA people. I always teach my students about that in class to show them, what the intellectual ideas of both of these people were, and have them just like think it through and challenge themselves to talk about difficult issues. And so I really enjoy teaching and helping young people. So that's one avenue that I think is really interesting. And I also love sort of working in policy. And as you guys know, I often work in sort of policy avenues with foreign policy research, or with the World House at Penn, that it ends up with me, this working class kid from Belfast, having dinner with John Kerry.
Amazing.
And just being like, hey, we have very different lives. How is being a billionaire? And so like I also like policy and would like to do stuff like that. But then I think with policy, what I find is that one of the things I like to do with policy is just like try to help people move in a direction that I think is building a more inclusive, more compassionate community. And the more I've sort of been here in America doing my PhD, dealing with my own issues, I have realized that maybe policy isn't the direction I want to go there. And more recently, like coming on board with someone to tell it to, for example, that would be like incredible to me if I could teach young people and then also help someone to tell it to grow into a national and then international organization. That, like, I think that the movement is so important. And in a world where we're seeing increasing polarization, increasing anger and resentment, and increasing loneliness and depression, right? The irony of the modern world is that we are more connected than we have ever been, and also more lonely than we have ever been.
Where'd you first hear that?
You guys.
That's right. That's right. Just kidding.
Yeah.
You're speaking our language, and
Yeah.
we really value that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Your check will be in the mail later.
That's right.
Thank you. But
Don't hold your breath, though.
but I think, like, like, as you guys talk about it all the time, and I think that it's so true. And when you see the story of someone to tell it to, obviously you guys have talked about it in the podcast, and obviously me working with someone to tell it to has been such an incredible pleasure. But when I look at my life and I look at, the things that I've done in peace work and the people who have inspired me, like Alec Reed or Ray Davey, like, I think someone to tell it to is even more powerful than any of that. I think that someone to transcend all borders, classes, anything, the gender, sexuality, all of it. Like, everybody in the world needs to be listened to, needs to feel someone who cares about them and has sort of a compassionate worldview. And if we can make someone tell it to a global organization, that would be part of my ideal, is teaching and then also working in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, even in an article that, as we were preparing for this, I was reading just about how the fact that Northern Ireland in particular is still in immense trauma
Mm-hmm.
as a result of the troubles, and the region has it said in this article, that has the highest suicide rate in the UK. And I know that we've talked about this.
Yeah, you're like, in any conflict zone, like, the suicide rate apparently in Northern Ireland is higher than in Israel, Palestine, and in many other places. 5,000 people have died in the 20 years since the troubles have been over, which is more than the 3,500 people who died in the 30 years of a war. And that's from suicide exclusively. So, like, people who died by suicide, we've had more people die by suicide than have been victims of a war. And so I'll say to people, like, a friend of mine is a professional boxer, Michael Conlon. He and I grew up in the same neighborhood. We went to the same school. He and I wrote an article together, and it was basically about how he can use his platform as a boxer to help combat this plague on our community, and I think that it's not just our community, but around the world, like you guys said. In America, when I was doing some research for policy stuff on mental health and healthcare, I found that 1 in 4 young people, like 1 in 4 people in high school in America, in Pennsylvania specifically, had thought about or contemplated suicide. And that world is just not a world that I think we should settle for. And I think that someone to tell it to has that answer, and I think you guys have had that answer for a long time, and hopefully we can bring that to everybody.
One of the things that we did together, I think it was in the fall, and forgive me if I can't remember the timeline, but we went and saw the movie Joker together.
Yeah.
And it's not a movie that probably any of us would have normally have chosen to go. It's very violent, and just as an FYI for everybody who's listening, but the storyline is very, very timely in the sense, and we've often said just the importance of sometimes just feeling things deeply in our bones, like deeply in our bowels. That's where the word compassion comes from, actually, is to feel deeply within our bowels. And sometimes you just need to really feel things. And it was good for us to go together to see that movie, to feel it deeply within our bowels, of just to be reminded again of why we are a part of this global listening movement, and the need for it. Because those feelings hopefully just evoke in all of us action to keep moving.
But I remember that afternoon, and then the three of us sat in the car in the movie theater parking lot. Not something in movie theaters aren't something anybody can do right now, but we remember the good old days when we could. But we sat in the parking lot, not wanting to separate from one another. I think, because of the power of the movie and what it provoked in us, the feelings and the thoughts and the images about loneliness and about what loneliness can do to people, and cause them to be violent, cause them to hurt other people, cause them to hurt themselves. And just remember, it was just also very powerful, us sitting together for quite a while and talking about what we heard, what we saw, what we felt, and just the images that it evoked in us. And yeah, that was a meaningful afternoon together that we appreciated very much, and one that we won't forget easily.
In fact, I just real quick, just as a disclaimer, encourage people to go to our website, someonetotell.org, and look under our blogs from last year. And we did a 3-part series, I remember, on what that film did to all of us. And it was meaningful for us to get our thoughts down on paper.
Yeah, I have a few things on this movie that I want to mention quickly, which is, the first one is, to anyone watching this 20 years from now in a post-COVID world, movie theater, or as a cinema, as I would call them, was this big room with like many seats that everyone sat together and show together.
For all these people who will never know this, right?
Yeah, for all of you who will never have had the experience of a movie theater and have read about it in history books, I just want you to know that it's this big, massive room with one giant screen. Yeah, but that's the first thing I want to say. But two is that, yeah, like I remember hearing about that movie, and I love comic book shows and comic book sort of movies. But I remember seeing that movie, and we've talked about this, and obviously we haven't talked about it on this podcast. But on my personal journey is that I have OCD, which includes a lot of intrusive thoughts and worries. And I was like, I can't go watch this movie because it's too violent, and I'll be like stuck with these thoughts for weeks or whatever. And so I told you guys about it because I was like, hey, like this looks like a movie that might be good for you guys. And you guys were like, I don't like violent movies either. And so
it was a vulnerable moment for all of us.
Yeah, that none of us wanted to go, but yet we knew we needed to.
Yeah, and I think and the reason I brought that up is that I think that was one of the times, and I've never said this to you guys before this, so this will be the first time you're hearing it, is that was one of the times that I was, convinced of the mission and of you guys, because I was sitting there, all three of us, and none of us really wanted to be in this violent and overly scary movie, but we all knew that, one, it would be good to see it together and be vulnerable in that sense, and that, two, it was good for someone to tell it to read, or to learn about this movie and this phenomenon and be able to talk to people about it. And so it was putting your personal worries and your personal vulnerabilities aside for a greater mission. And I was like, this is incredibly powerful when you think about it. And this is just, like I said to you guys before, it's the everyday stuff that you have, like that we live, that is often the most powerful. And so to you guys, it was just, going to the cinema with me to watch a scary movie. But for me, I was like, well, this is them living the mission. Like this is it in action. You're being vulnerable, like you say, like what's on our website, and you're doing something for the rest of the world that involves putting yourself in a situation that isn't always comfortable, but is for contacting other people to talk to them through the blog, saying to them like, hey, this is what we thought. This is social isolation. This is mental health issues. And, that blog series was incredibly powerful in that sense.
Well, thank you. We never thought of going to the movie in the way you had. So we appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you.
And just coming full circle, I mean, this is exactly why we do these podcast episodes as well, is for people like Conor to be able to tell their stories, for us to tell our stories. And I know in one of these blogs, and we also use this quote in our second book, Someone to Tell To, Moved with Compassion. And I wanted to share it today for our listeners, and then kind of, again, come full circle here. Of just this topic of vulnerability and openness and the need to have someone to tell it to. And it comes from Meredith Gray. And she said, people have scars in all sorts of unexpected places, like secret roadmaps of their personal histories, diagrams of all their old wounds. Most of our wounds heal, leaving nothing behind but a scar, but some of them don't. Some wounds we carry with us everywhere, and though the cut's long gone, the pain still lingers. And Conor, today we know that there's a lot of pain still that we could spend, we will spend a lifetime with you unpacking as us about our own. And it's just a good reminder for all of us of the need to do that, to keep processing, to keep talking. That's why this mission exists. And so for those of you who are listening, if you need to talk, we are here to listen. That's what this is all about. We want to be those compassionate listeners for you.
And before we go, Conor, we want to give you the last word here. We've come full circle from the beginning of this this podcast, and we asked you to share with our listeners what this day was supposed to be today. It's supposed to be your wedding day. You and Leah were to be married today in Dublin, Ireland, and because of COVID, you're not. Your wedding's going to happen next year in Ireland, and we hope that there are no problems when that day comes. So, and we're just really sorry that it couldn't happen today, the way you had planned it, the way you and Leah envisioned it and dreamed that it would be. So, we put you on the spot here. I hope it's not too much on the spot. Is there anything anything you would like to say today to Leah?
Leah?
About what this day means to you.
That's a good thing to ask again. So yeah, I think to Leah, what I would mostly want to say is that, it's unfortunate that we are not able to celebrate being in love and the rest of our life today. But that doesn't mean that I don't cherish her and care about her every single day. And that, when the wedding comes, it'll be fantastic, it'll be beautiful, and it'll be incredible to be able to celebrate that together with our friends and our family. But she's still the greatest thing that's ever happened in my life, regardless of any academic achievement or anything else. I think that being together with Leah is, one of the most amazing experiences I've had, because this is someone who is compassionate and empathetic and naturally understands both my many shortcomings and also the shortcomings of others, and acts in a way that helps those people. And so I love her dearly, and when the wedding comes, it'll be great, but we'll still cherish every moment until then and after. And it'll eventually happen. And I mean, when it does, that'll be perfect. But I we can't beat the pandemic right now, but once it's done, we'll we'll be good. It's exciting time.
Yes.
We've said this often lately, that I know with my own kids, and for all of us, we're all of life, we're always learning about adaptability, just to
Mhm.
adapt to the situations that come to us. And we can't change them, but we can do our best to overcome them as they come. And we do that in community. And that's why we're here together today. And so we hope this was about as good of a second option as you could get today.
There is, if it was not my wedding, there is nowhere else I'd rather be than helping this mission.
Thank you.
uh,
Thank you.
Before we do go, I mean, maybe we can put this in somewhere else. I don't know. I did want to ask you guys, just before we do go, in terms of someone to tell it to. You asked me what my future holds, and I was wondering if you guys could tell me what you think you would want people to know about someone to tell it to, and what you think, the future holds for us.
It's our job to ask the questions.
Clark will just cut all this out.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, but actually, we appreciate that. And you've already answered it a bit a few moments ago, when you said that you envision someone to tell it to being an organization that is global. And in some ways, many ways, we do have a global outreach for the people in at least a dozen countries with whom we've listened and talked and learned, and as well as across the United States. We just want that to grow. We want we want to help people realize that there is an epidemic of loneliness, and it's global. And that in an age of great connection technologically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually, we are not very connected. In fact, might be more disconnected than we've ever been in history. And we want to change that in whatever way we can, by education, by training, by simply listening, to show people that is the first step in us connecting with one another. It's the first step in helping to change the world, helping to make the world better. It's the first step in peace, to reconciliation, to preventing so many of the conflicts that we have among us as human beings. Listening, we believe, is at the core, a fundamental core. And we want the world to know that, to believe it, and to live it. So that's our vision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wanted to say as well, since we're leaving, thank you guys for everything Someone to Tell It To has done for me personally, and also, for what it's going to do and is already doing for people around the world.
Thank you. And while we're still here, I just want to say, those of you who are listening, if you like the Someone to Tell It To podcast, if you learn from them, if you've enjoyed this episode and it's inspired you in some way and taught you something in some way, we hope that you'll consider supporting us. And in fact, we're saying this because Conor is on here right now. Conor is the one who led us to Patreon, which is an online vehicle to support Someone to Tell It To. And Conor was our very first donor on Patreon to Someone to Tell It To for the Someone to Tell It To podcast. So we hope that you'll go to Someone to Tell It To, or to patreon.org, and maybe donate to help support these podcasts, to make them possible, to help pay Clark, our technician, who's so patient and makes us sound so much better than we are, can he'll edit this out now.
Yeah.
I can't say it right. Who edits out everything that we mess up or say incorrectly or wrong. and helps us to sound good. So we hope that you'll support this. You'll support this effort. And again, we appreciate you, Conor, for introducing us to Patreon and the ability to do this. And so we just thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to you listening again. So thank you. Bye.